Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years of leading debates in the European Parliament on responsible business, I host our discussions on developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the G in ESG governance. How are decisions made, roles and responsibilities distributed, proper oversight and accountability achieved within the company to ensure that sustainability issues are properly considered? A new set of principles on climate and nature governance was launched at the recent World Economic Forum, drawn up in conjunction with the Chapter Zero Alliance, which itself works with 100,000 board directors in 70 countries worldwide. Its chief executive and a leading mover behind the new principles is Emily Farnworth, and I'm delighted that she's here to discuss them on Frankly Speaking. Emily, a warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Richard. It's an absolutely delightful thing to be here with you. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Before we get into the topic, I asked my guests, how did you get into sustainability in your life or in your career first? What was it that brought you into these issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess it's a few things. I grew up in a small village in North Wales, and so we sort of had nature on our doorsteps. And I spent a lot of time when I was a child, kind of exploring the woods and kind of like being outdoors and just being in nature. And I guess I had a kind of a love for it from a very young age, and I think that just carried through. And as I kind of got older and I kind of could read a bit more about pollution and what was going on in the world, I just felt like, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why on earth aren't people and organizations and businesses in particular, why don't they just, figure out how they can make what they're making or do what they're doing without having such an impact on nature? And I think it was just a natural curiosity that led me into this space. I was a Girl Guide and I liked doing badges. And I think I was always quite struck with having kind of projects to do. So I think that's probably helped a little bit in my early career as a consultant. I kind of liked kind of mapping things out and getting stuff done. So I think that's probably carried me through a little bit as well. I don't know if that, if that resonates with you at all, but yeah, those were some of the things that drew me into what I'm doing now, and kind of a little bit about me, I suppose.
I was drummed out of the Cubs myself, but I didn't do anything terrible. I was actually ill and didn't turn up for a while, and they just decided to go with me. So that played zero with my own entry into sustainability. Now let's talk about these principles of climate governance. Really interesting piece of work, and we won't do them all together. We'll go through them one by one. But even before that, you must meet board members, and I do, who are pretty skeptical about climate and how much impact it really has on the company. What is the very simple case when you meet board members that you put to them that says, hang on, no, this is something you need to address?
Mm. Yeah, and I think it normally actually starts with understanding a little bit about who they are and kind of their perspective, because what I've found is that quite often you really do need to have a conversation that resonates and kind of can meet somebody where they're already at. And so learning about their background and how their views have been shaped gives you an insight into whether or not they've had a particular career experience where there hasn't necessarily been kind of top of mind, whether or not they have a peer group who perhaps are, biased in a particular way to not really thinking about some of the climate science, for example. Whether or not they do read the newspapers and they do have a sort of sense of what's going on within climate change, but actually what's really driving their comment is to do with the feeling that there's other priorities for a particular business that they're involved in. So the first thing for me is always to sort of get a better understanding of where they're going to be coming from. It's not really necessarily very productive to even create an argument, to be quite honest. That's partly what you need to find out. But just to understand, is it going to be about legacy and long-term value creation that's going to sort of switch them on? Is it about thinking about the innovation associated with low carbon technology? So you don't necessarily talk about climate change or nature at all using those words, but you might talk about the kind of growth in trend in a particular technology that is actually going to be solving the problem. So I think my experience is that, being able to make the conversation relevant and in a way that's going to resonate with an individual, whether it's on a very pragmatic perspective, whether it's on a business argument perspective, whether it's on a more kind of emotional level, I think is actually really important. And I think we found that time and time again when we engage with directors, that people are coming from very different perspectives and experiences.
So not a single answer. Um,
No,
uh,
I wish it was that easy.
and that will be true in our audience today, of course. Now, as I say, let's not try and do all the principles and foundations at once. Let's actually go through them. And the first principle that you've got is oversight and responsibility. Clearly, that's crucial to the board in every aspect. But each year I read the INSEAD annual survey of board members on ESG, and it shows there is a stubborn maintenance of a gap in terms of skills and knowledge of board members, with fewer than 1 in 3 feeling competent to give oversight on sustainability issues. So the question is not that needs to change, but why it hasn't changed and why you think these principles might help it to change now.
Mm. Yeah, and we've obviously, as you can imagine, kind of spent a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, one direction that we've come from in the context of this principle is the basics of fiduciary duties in the context of company law, which is remarkably, similar in many respects, no matter where you are in the world. Um, One of the things that we've recognized is that, well, there's maybe two dimensions to this. Firstly, that there's quite a lot of, I guess, inherent doctrine around business oversight and responsibility in the context of a board director and in the context of fiduciary duties is only related to profitability, is only related to shareholder returns, which of course is not true. But there's a lot of learning that goes on, actually in quite a lot of educational institutes, which kind of perpetuates this myth, or it's been learned from such a long time ago, where actually that was sort of very much a priority, and people didn't really understand the link between climate change, nature loss, and profitability and economic strength, in previous years. So what we're finding is that the fiduciary duty hasn't changed. The sort of requirement for a director in the context of this oversight responsibility hasn't necessarily changed, but our understanding of the impact of climate change and nature loss in the context of long-term value creation. And also, let's face it, there's two sides to this. There's both the financial risk because of the impact and the degradation of the environment, but there's also the opportunity side of things as well, if companies can see where the new market trends are coming. So I think really what we're doing here is requiring that there's a kind of a re-education almost in understanding the kind of the critical nature of these environmental issues in the context of the economic argument and the profitability of a company in a real financial sense, but also in the context of sort of society at large, and that kind of need for kind of boards to take account of multiple stakeholder views and not just pure shareholders' views.
If anyone wants to listen back to the former podcast we had with Beta Scharfel about directors' duties and how fiduciary duty has to take account of climate, please do that. In your principles, Emily, there's not a lot of mechanics in there. When I listen to debates around governance, I hear questions about should the company have a sustainability committee of the board? Should it be part of the audit and risk committee? Should there be a sustainability champion on the board? Should sustainability go in with finance? Should the chief sustainability officer report to the CEO, attend the board meeting? There's a lot of questions like that around. You
Yeah.
touch on them, but you don't provide, again, a single answer to any of them. How would you say companies should approach those sorts of questions?
Yeah, it's important and it's quite intentional because every company is quite different in terms of what's going to work. And in some jurisdictions, there are also differences in the way that, boards and committees relate to one another. There are a few things that we've heard from um, multiple organizations and directors. Um, Ultimately, because there is so much information and because there's actually quite a lot of number crunching and kind of understanding about the organization that needs to happen throughout the organization, it's quite useful if there is a group, whether it's a formal committee, whether it's a working group, whether it's some kind of function at an executive level within an organization that can do a lot of the data analysis, if you like, in order to synthesize something that can then go up to the board. So whatever kind of construct there is to be able to have a body that can do, the kind of the heavy lifting, whether it's a risk analysis, whether it's looking at kind of putting together a business case, whether it's looking to put together an investment case, all of these things can kind of quite often be usefully carried out in a group of people outside of the actual board itself. But what you then need to do is make sure that kind of group has got a kind of clear line of mandate, if you like, from the board, a clear strand of accountability into the boardroom, and that it's not reliant on just one individual who is held responsible for the decisions of the whole board. Um, there is an argument to suggest, and certainly our view, that there has to be a kind of basic level of understanding around climate and nature, risk and opportunity across the whole board in order for specialist information coming up to the boardroom to receive enough debate, kicking the tires on ideas, making a kind of sensible, well-informed decision. It may be in certain businesses having very specialist knowledge of some of these topics in the boardroom is very helpful because of the nature of the industry, sector, and because of the severity of risk and opportunity of climate and nature, in the context of that company. And so there are, I guess there are certain things like that which, whether, how you do that, and what construct is probably differs from company to company. I think the point around things like, embedding it into an audit committee, sometimes in a finance committee, we kind of heard things also kind of in terms of, the role of the general counsel or company secretary. There's all sorts of different ways in which you can really kind of kind of skill up, if you like, um, the kind of infrastructure that there is to make decisions. But ultimately, like any issue, whether it's, cybersecurity risk, whether it's kind of workforce issues, whether it's a new kind of geopolitical risk, ultimately there has to be an awareness across the whole board, but then an agreement and kind of where the detailed work needs to happen within the organizational structure to enable the board to make sensible decisions. So again, I appreciate it's not necessarily one size fits all, but there are some good practices. And maybe just to finally say, it's not that, I think the one thing that we've heard is that the danger of bringing in a kind of specialist, if you like, climate or nature individual as a single board member, they kind of become a point of contact. And either there's too much accountability on one individual to make a decision, or there's some scapegoating. And if that person is not going to have a majority vote or a majority, kind of role in the decision making, then you can end up with some quite, unintended consequences of that dynamic. So there is a sort of need for basic understanding, and then other structures that will allow for kind of deeper dives into the real detail to be able to provide the board with the right information. But just one final point: without the understanding at the board level, you also risk the danger of directors not being able to ask the right questions of the exec teams when there are things that come through. So this is why it's so important for there to be a good level of competence and capability across the board.
So definitely the whole board and not a single champion I get from that.
Yeah, just to make the point, because I guess, just to be clear, it's also, not every board director needs a PhD in climate science either. I think it's a sort of, getting the balance right of expectation and, what's actually going to be credible and necessary.
And I hear a lot about skills and skilling up, and I hear about recruitment. You hear a bit less about board evaluation. And if sustainability is built into board evaluation mechanisms, just as routine, that is the way that this will begin to change over time.
Absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
first principle then is in relation to skills and oversight and responsibility. The second one is strategy. Now that's not new. In the new era of reporting standards, both at the European and the global level, how sustainability fits in to business strategy and business model is an absolute cornerstone of what companies are being asked to do. But what I liked especially about your report was the focus on really incorporating future-looking orientation and seeing this as strategic oversight. And there'd be very few in boards that would say you shouldn't have strategic oversight. And if you see it that way rather than as something separate, I think that can help boards.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
how would you say that sustainability can become an authentic part of business strategy?
I think, and this is also quite interesting in the context of, launching the principles this year alongside the World Economic Forum risk report. Um, I think what we see is that there are so many competing risks at the moment in the short term. But when you look at the long term, the kind of the climate and nature risks sort of really kind of loom large. And I think at a strategic level, having businesses that can both understand that yes, they need to address the immediate issues, which include, in many cases, some of the physical risks associated with climate change. So there's a need for building resilience, there's a need for being able to adapt and respond to the immediate piece of the jigsaw. But there's also a need to be able to build for the long term, kind of lower carbon, lower impact on nature kind of market for the future. So the reason that the sort of strategy piece is so important is that the board directors, just by the nature often of the whole, reason that they're playing a role in as an independent voice in the boardroom. They've had a lot of experience across multiple sectors. They've had a lot of experience in different companies going through all sorts of different kind of challenging times. And so the ability for them to genuinely kind of bring their leadership, their insight into how to manage this sort of short-term tensions with the long-term growth opportunities is really critical. And what we have often heard from board directors, particularly over the last, I would say, sort of, 5 to 10 years, where there's been so much nitty-gritty kind of regulation and focus on some of the technical aspects of sustainability that they sometimes can kind of get a little bit drowned in, actually being able to kind of give them the opportunity to sort of almost lift themselves up from the detail and think strategically about their organization, their strengths and weaknesses in the market today, and how they can see that market evolving into the long term because of whether it's policy shifts, whether it's consumer demand shifts, whether it's societal expectations shifts. Being able to have, that sort of longer term view and to be able to have a conversation in the boardroom that can really bring to life the creativity that they can bring has both a kind of genuine debate around what may be difficult conversations in the short term, but for long term benefit, but also to kind of really open up the genuine opportunities for different markets, different products, different services, so to enable the kind of the discussion to, I don't know, probably take on a slightly different flavor to some of the very short term and immediate issues that can kind of, really hamper a business if that's all they're going to be focused on. So I don't know if that sort of helps to bring this to life a little bit.
We keep coming back to short term versus long term. Now, the third and fourth principles are pretty well known to, frankly speaking, listeners. They are risk and opportunity. You've just been talking there about opportunity and also our old friend disclosure and transparency. Um, uh, So I think we don't need to deal with those in great detail. Just give me a practical example on either of those that you've seen in a company board where it really makes a difference to the board.
Yeah, maybe just two things I'll touch on because they seem to, they seem to crop up in all sorts of different circles, depending on a corporate appetite to genuinely understand the trend around the cost of carbon and the likelihood for there over time to be a genuine cost of carbon in order to be able to build in and see the opportunity of looking at how that can help. So, for example, organizations that create a shadow price on investments can then quite quickly understand and react to a potential risk of a higher cost of carbon or a mandated cost of carbon if the compliance, market increases in the way that we, sometimes believe that there will be that trend. Um, I think it's not just about being able to spot the risk, to kind of turn that risk into something that becomes a way of bringing it into the business decision making that is currently supported by, the way that companies will do the analysis in the first place, but also just to have the confidence to be able to call out, where even if a risk is not necessarily biting today, there is enough confidence, enough leadership, enough understanding about the necessity that we have to address climate change to know this is the direction of travel to actually build it in. And or yes, to manage that it is a risk because you're starting to account for it on a financial level, but also to understand the risk and not say it's not affecting us today, therefore we shouldn't take it into account because you see time and time again companies making decisions without kind of taking those things into account, really making quite damaging decisions from a climate change perspective. On the flip side, on the opportunity side, there's some amazing work that gets done by the Inevitable Policy Response. And if you look at the data there and you look at the trends in policy that we see by either a pledge by a government, a soft commitment from a government, or sometimes the kind of the regulation and the policy that's in place to phase out combustion engines or phase out the use of fossil content in a particular product or whatever it might be, when you start to look at how those future trends might look, you could look at it as a risk, kind of through a risk lens, depending on which sector you're in. But you could also look at it through an opportunity lens to say, well, if these policies are going to play out, as we can see that they have been doing, because we've now starting to build up enough evidence to say that they are kind of, implementable over time, then what are the markets that are going to be opening up as a result of this? I mean, we've already seen it in the energy markets for solar products, the electric vehicle markets growing because of the long-term policy trends. So I think from an opportunity perspective, I would suggest that there is plenty of information around the policy measures, the kind of corporate and government commitments that are out there to be able to spot the trends, but only if you're going to look for them in the context of seeing climate and nature as, a business opportunity space rather than simply not looking for some of these things. And when there's so much going on in the world, I would, for most businesses, anything that's going to give them an edge in terms of knowing where their future markets might be going, I think is got to, is got to be a positive. So maybe just to provide a couple of examples of some of the things that we think and see playing out a little bit in the conversations we're having.
Now you have these three foundations, the first skills and knowledge that we've discussed. The second one is stakeholder collaboration. And again, there'd be few of our listeners who will disagree with that. But what struck me reading your principles is that it was very much about the mindset of the board towards stakeholders, how they think about stakeholders. Explain a bit about of your thinking about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. And the three foundational aspects to the principles evolved quite naturally from the conversations we had during the consultation. The original set of principles that we had were sort of separate, all separated. And when we were doing the consultation, what became quite clear is that the three foundational pillars, if you like, were so relevant to all of those four guiding principles, the core principles, that they became these foundational pieces. In terms of the stakeholder collaboration, again, it was really interesting to hear time and time again that in the early days, whether it was corporate responsibility, whether it was sustainability, whether it was ESG, whichever kind of direction that companies were coming from it, it was very much a one-way street. So they might have an exercise where they would go out to the local community, they would go out to an NGO community, they would go out to think tanks and policymakers, and they would listen, but they wouldn't necessarily, they might take that information back in and then, decide internally what to do with that information. What came across quite strongly is this need for collaboration, in that there are so many trade-offs that businesses are needing to make now, in the same way that governments are, in the same way that, any kind of, community group is having to in many ways. And so there was a specific intent in building in the word collaboration to signal the need for not just a dialogue with stakeholders, but the development of meaningful relationships and collaborations so that there can be a negotiation around where different groups can have win-wins. So where corporations do genuinely have to engage with, civil society organizations or local communities or whatever it might need in order to come up with a shared solution that would be, manageable, fixable, meaningful for all parties in the longer term. Skills around being able to engage, collaborate, negotiate, build collective understanding, build kind of collective trust almost with particular areas that are needed for all parties to move forward is really, really critical. And that comes across everything. So whether you're talking about strategy, whether you're talking about looking at risks and opportunities, whether you're talking even at the disclosure level, what kind of information do you need to share with which kind of stakeholder groups in order to create a meaningful relationship is really important.
And what's jumped out at me was it's not tick the box, have we done our stakeholder consultation? It's very much
Yeah.
owning it and
Yeah.
really thinking about it and being part of it.
In the context of the work that you've been doing and over the years, I mean, do you see that change? And is it just rhetoric still, or is it actually genuinely moving in that direction? I mean, what's your sense of kind of how important that's become?
I think we've still got a long way to go. That there are lots of people, including you and your network, that are working very hard to try and change it. I mentioned the INSEAD study earlier. Self-definition by board members themselves say they're not yet there. And so I
Yeah.
think we need to treat that seriously. But as you say, for every company that goes down because it hasn't updated its business model, that is a warning to
Yeah.
every other company and every other board. I was going to ask you about the third foundation culture, but again, the argument that corporate culture is crucial is important and I think well understood by audience. So I must ask you the devil's advocate question. Um, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, is a pretty safe space to discuss sustainability. The world has good and bad corporate governance, and if you look at corporate governance specialists, and these are figures from global data, they say the biggest failures are tax avoidance, corruption, excessive executive remuneration, and unethical lobbying. Sustainability isn't even on the list. And if you think about the biggest so-called corporate scandals in corporate governance, Enron, Boeing, Satyam, Barings Bank, uh, sustainability is not there. It creeps in with Volkswagen from a few years ago, but essentially it's not there. And so you've got cut through in the World Economic Forum to a relatively friendly audience. How can you and we get cut through to an audience in corporate governance where still sustainability in many respects isn't scoring?
Yeah, yeah. And I maybe kind of go back a little bit to where I started, because what's been interesting to me with the work that we've been doing is that because of the nature of independent directors, they're obviously often sitting in multiple boards. They are individuals, they're employed as individuals, and actually being able to sort of really think about this community as those individual people and what matters to them on a personal level kind of is linked a little bit to this mindset piece and to this piece around changing culture and changing mindsets and collaboration. So, and I wouldn't say I have the answers to this by a long way, but I think what's been interesting is when you talk to the directors who do get this, quite often it's a very personal journey they've been on, either because they're thinking about their children or grandchildren or kind of family members, or because the penny has really dropped from a a profitability perspective, a long-term kind of value creation perspective. And so I guess, what we're really doing in the work that we've set up, and the sort of the network of chapters working with directors around the world, is to really kind of think about that individual and try and understand the motivations, I suppose, for ensuring that the values that they hold dear in the context of their personal lives also kind of play out in the corporate sense. And I know that's much easier said than done. Maybe to just bring that to life a little bit more, what we've been observing, and I don't, there probably is a raft of research on this. I haven't got the statistics at my fingertips, but it's been really interesting talking to some of the next generation board directors of family businesses where there is a genuine legacy issue at stake, if you like, and the intergenerational conversations that are taking place between the younger family members and the older family members is often, the younger family members are often kind of much more alive to the sustainability issues and the severity of the situation that we're facing, and will bring that to their elders, if you like. Whereas their elders, who they deeply respect and are, quite often, parents or grandparents in many cases, they will be, um, they've seen a lot of the world. They've seen, kind of how things have shifted, but that kind of intergenerational conversation that goes on naturally in family business is really making a difference because it's genuinely kind of bringing a personal connection. So for some corporate boards run by completely independents and the executive teams, thinking about some of those intergenerational conversations or thinking about the stakeholders who are particularly impacted and can bring different stories and narratives into the boardroom is one way of just being able to make the whole conversation a little bit more human. It's not going to work in every single case where you've got a culture that's only interested in short-term profitability at any cost. But I think for the boards who are genuinely looking for ways in which they can open up their understanding, genuinely want to be able to think about the long-term future as well as managing the short-term risks, I think some of these opportunities to make this very real for individuals in the context of a conversation rather than hiding behind some of the corporate structures and the corporate legal systems that can allow for the wrong behaviors to kind of come through, I think is really important and certainly an important focus for the work that we do.
And of course, if you take the world, in the vast number of countries, family businesses, founder businesses, as they call them in India, are the complete norm. I know
Yeah.
that's not true in the biggest markets, but if we're genuinely trying to change what companies are doing worldwide, it's a really important argument. Emily, it's got to be the last question, but one of the things I like about your principles is under each of them, you have a set of questions
Yeah.
that can be put to board members and to senior management to make them real and make them live.
Yeah.
You've got 50,000, frankly speaking, listeners listening at this point. Uh, um, what one question
Oh
do you
gosh.
want to suggest that each of our listeners ask themselves to make this a reality?
One question I think, if you're a director listening to this, what do you want your contribution to be to making the company that you're sitting on a board of successful in the next 50 years? And I guess in the context of turning that question into a question to peers and to the executive team, maybe it's a question of, what one thing, would you want to change with the way that the company is currently setting out its strategy to ensure that we can do the best possible thing we can for, the generations that will be around in 50 years' time? And I appreciate yeah, you give me a very difficult question, but maybe that kind of gives you a sense as to that opens up then a whole raft of other questions that you might want to ask yourself or to discuss as a board.
Well, whether this podcast is still going in 50 years' time or it will have a successor of some kind, we'll invite you back and see how well that question has been answered. We have reached the end of our time. We started off with a very clear argument that you put forward about fiduciary duty, incorporating climate and climate science. In structures of the board, you talked about having some sort of data gathering and verification role outside of the board, but you very much made the case that this is a whole board responsibility. You and I talked about this being about strategic oversight. You said in some ways board members should lift their eyes beyond the detail and think about the strategic opportunities that exist for the business. And you talked about the importance of family businesses and in different generations within the family having the discussion about what sort of legacy they want the company to achieve. And in that final answer, you said each of us should ask where we want the company to be in 50 years' time. I won't go quiet, but everyone should be thinking of the answer right now. Sadly, we have come to the end of our podcast. The guiding principles for climate and nature governance are free to download from the Chapter Zero Alliance website. Thank you so much to Emily Farnworth for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Emily and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.